Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Jared Hogan, and I'm presenting my master's research titled Marginalized Visibility, Scrutinizing the Digital Representation of Indigenous Cultures at Red Bay National Historic Site, Labrador, and Lantern Meadows National Historic Site, Newfoundland. So first I want to start off with a territory acknowledgement. So this is a picture or a map of Newfoundland and Labrador, which is made up of the mainland portion of the province, which is Labrador, and the island of Newfoundland. And I'm located on the island of Newfoundland in our capital city of St. John's. So I'm just borrowing this territory acknowledgement from Memorial University. So we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of the province. And because you're probably joining in from Saskatchewan, I've added this territory acknowledgement from the University of Saskatchewan. As we gather here today, we acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And if you're not joining us from Newfoundland and Labrador or Saskatchewan, I encourage you to take a moment to recognize whose land you're existing on right now. So who am I? So my name is Jared Hogan, like I said, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Archaeology at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. I have a Master of Arts degree in anthropology, a BA in archaeology, and a Bachelor's of Science in psychology, as well as a certificate in Indigenous studies. What am I presenting? So I'm presenting my master's research, and with that, there's five main sections: my project scope, my literature review, my methods, my results and discussion, and my recommendations for moving forward. So project scope. So to give you an idea of this project, these are some things that have been said to Indigenous community members from non-Indigenous community members regarding their thoughts on Indigenous occupation in the province. So geez, I thought we killed all you guys was said to a Mi'kmaq elder, and there are no First Peoples of Newfoundland was said to a Mi'kmaq community member. So this gives you the idea that there's not a lot of belief that there's Indigenous peoples in our province. And if there is, it's in Labrador, it's not on the island of Newfoundland, which is totally incorrect. But these beliefs are there. Where are these beliefs coming from? So these beliefs are coming from provincial politics, school curriculums, and heritage initiatives such as museums and guided tours. So all of these things contribute to whitewashed Eurocentric rhetoric. So for example, no Indians in quotation marks in Newfoundland and Labrador. So as some of you may know, Newfoundland and Labrador joined Canada in 1949, so relatively recently. And as part of that, Indigenous peoples in this province were left out of the terms of union. So they weren't recognized under the Indian Act the same way other Indigenous groups were in Canada. So this obviously set back their ability to self-determine and set up governments for themselves. And as well as this, school curriculums taught a lack of Indigenous presence in the province, such as settlers had discovered the island and the mainland, being Labrador, and they had perpetuated this mercenary myth that the Mi'kmaq were brought to the island of Newfoundland by the French in order to fight off other Indigenous inhabitants, which would be the Beothuk, which is now an extinct Indigenous group in Newfoundland. And for context, this mercenary myth, which I think is the next point, yeah, is something that has been taught from the 40s all the way up to the 90s. My parents learned about it, my classmates learned about it. It's untrue, but it's something that has been perpetuated through public school curriculums. We also see ancient Indians, ancient Indian bands, the use of prehistoric peoples. These words are all either in school curriculums, heritage initiatives, things like that. And we also see, and not just in Newfoundland and Labrador, but across North America and Australia and with other settler states, we see that Indigenous peoples are placed alongside the natural history, such as extinct plants, extinct animals, things like that. They're very much put in as a group of the past, not a contemporary group, which is untrue. So, what is the impact? So, we see a problematic historical narrative that discredits Newfoundland and Labrador's Indigenous people before and after colonization. It also delegitimizes Indigenous groups' historical knowledge and who they are and where they come from. It also indicates that Indigenous groups have assimilated into Euro Canadian society, which is not true. Indigenous groups are very much present and resilient. And where are we now? And this slide particularly pertains to heritage. So we have started to decolonize heritage a little bit, slowly but surely. And this is done through correcting harmful terminology, indigenizing exhibitions, and retelling Indigenous history free of whitewashing. And I have some examples here. This one is from Newfoundland and Labrador. So there's a museum formerly called the Mary March Museum, which is the name of a Beothuk woman who was captured by the English and given the name Mary March. And this museum was dedicated to her and how much she's helped identify things within the Beothuk culture. However, the Mi'kmaq community, whose land this museum is located in, had advocated to have the name changed to her Beothuk name, which is Dematuit. And this has been a 20-plus year process, but it's finally going through and the name is being changed. And we also have some artifacts that belong to the Mi'kmaq being sent back to Nova Scotia from US museums, where they've been for decades. We also see back in Newfoundland that there are being some Beothuk bones repatriated to the province that have been in Scotland for quite some time. And out on the West Coast, the Royal BC Museum has closed its exhibition that perpetuates colonial narratives and has dedicated to make a exhibit with First Peoples in collaboration with Indigenous groups. So my project scope. So I have three objectives. So to provide a context for current visibility of Indigenous cultures and heritage, both broadly and provincially, based on academic and gray literature. I also want to scrutinize Indigenous representation in Newfoundland and Labrador's non-Indigenous led digital heritage. And finally, I want to identify recommendations to help improve Indigenous representation in Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly in the digital heritage. So as part of this, I've done a literature review, and my literature review includes how Indigenous cultures they intersect the fields of cultural heritage, public archaeology and anthropology, and museum studies as well. So first up is cultural heritage. So this explores the intersection of culture as an anthropological notion and heritage as a way of commemorating the past and carrying things that carry on modern historical importance. So traditionally, this neglects Indigenous perspectives of heritage and cultural importance. And we see this in the way that the settler state recognizes National Historic Sites of Canada or UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Um, an example of Parks Canada recognizing heritage sites in the Canadian Arctic. It was done as a way of establishing sovereignty over the Arctic when questioned by Russia and the United States and other countries. They put these heritage sites up there that were often Indigenous to say, look, we have a long Canadian occupation in this area. These are definitely our lands. So while it did bring attention to heritage sites or Indigenous heritage sites in the North, they weren't necessarily for the proper reasons. And then jurisdictions have started to slowly include Indigenous voices in the discourse of state heritage. And this is usually having Indigenous peoples as the rights holders and authorities on uh, their artifacts and their exhibitions or exhibitions reflecting their culture. And indigenization pushes the field of anthropology outside the bounds of Eurocentrism. So this helps improve and make our discipline more inclusive. So then public anthropology and Indigenous cultures. So public anthropology involves engaging the public in anthropological research. So this obviously plays a vital role in how Indigenous peoples are perceived in the public eye. So early anthropology showed the public that Indigenous peoples were barely subhuman and primitive. And I have those in quotation marks and bolded because I found some quotes from past anthropologists, which I thought were just crazy that they were even possible, or it was possible to think that way rather. So this is shown in looting activities and the practice of creating human zoos. And also, public opinion was then fueled by this early anthropological thought and developed into racist policies and ideology. And those include the Indian Act, the idea of a dead Indian or ancient savage, really perpetuating Indigenous people as a thing of the past. So collaboration is needed to correct these historical inaccuracies that have been perpetuated and presented in public anthropology initiatives. So this would involve updating outdated language, changing inaccurate exhibits at museums and monuments, and things like that. So then finally, museum studies and Indigenous cultures. So museums are institutions dedicated to preserving, storing, and displaying past and present artifacts, and they serve as tourist attractions, educational centers, and symbols of state power. So then museum studies is the interdisciplinary study of these spaces, including the creation, storage, display of artifacts, along with the knowledge, interpretation, and conservation of such objects, or artifacts rather. So museums are innately colonial. They are designed to display local and non-local artifacts. Indigenous cultures are popularly presented in these museums as a way of trying to preserve the dying Indian while creating an authentic experience to gather in patrons and paying clientele. Um, so museums must naturally work with Indigenous communities on what can and cannot be displayed moving forward. So then I have my theoretical frameworks. So the main theoretical framework that guided my inquiry is responsible exhibition. So this states that the careful presentation of Indigenous knowledge and cultural artifacts must be based on Indigenous collaboration. And there's three main principles that can be applied here. So promoting reconciliation, even when uncomfortable truths emerge that challenge this accepted settler narrative, presenting historical events from different points of view using authentic primary Indigenous sources, and then finally showing visitors the historical impacts of settler colonial administration on Indigenous communities in the past and in the present. And as well, in addition to responsible exhibition, I also use restorative justice, which states that those responsible for the wrongdoings must listen openly to those who they've harmed in order to repair damages and move forward together. And I also use community and Indigenous archaeology frameworks, which states that work must be conducted with, by, and for the community, and the community must be involved in every stage of the research process. So next up are my methods. So in this study, I focused on the digital representation of two sites in particular, and they had Indigenous and settler components. So first up, I looked at Red Bay, Labrador on the south coast of Labrador, and then Lanson Meadows on the island of Newfoundland, and it's on the Great Northern Peninsula, right up on the tip. So these are both National Historic Sites of Canada, and they're designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites as well. And they have similar mixed Indigenous and settler occupations, so these characteristics made them more easily comparable than other sites in the province. So then Red Bay, Labrador. So you can see here that it's located on the south coast of Labrador in the purple circle. I don't know if you can see my mouse. And like I said, it's a National Historic Site of Canada and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it was inscribed in 2012. It sees about 8,000 visitors per year. It is most well known for its Basque whaling post, one of the biggest ones in Canada at the time. And it also has evidence for Indigenous occupation before, during, and after the Basque. And these included the Dorset, Grosswater, Maritime Archaic, Pre-Inuit, Inuit, and Innu, and its cultural significance. So it has a highly preserved underwater archaeology site and an on-land archaeology site, and it has the potential for European and Indigenous interactions as well. And currently it's located on the traditional territory of Nakatuva Inuit and also Labrador Innu. Then Lanson Meadows, which is up here on the Great Northern Peninsula on the island of Newfoundland. It's also a National Historic Site of Canada, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but this one was described way earlier in 1978. So it sees about 28,000 visitors per year. It's a little bit more busy than what Red Bay is. It was best known for it being a temporary Viking settlement in approximately 1000 AD. It has a diverse history of Indigenous occupation before and after the Vikings, and these include the Maritime Archaic, the Grosswater, Pre-Inuit, Middle Dorset, Cowhead Complex, the Point Revenge Complex, Little Passage Complex, and the Mi'kmaq. Cultural significance is the first European site in the Americas, so it's associated with Leif Erikson's Vinland Camp, and it has the potential again for European and Indigenous interactions as well. And currently it is it's occupied by the Great Northern Peninsula Mi'kmaq Band. So then the methods that I used in my inquiry, so I used two. So the first one is the digital media analysis. So it looks at how Indigenous groups are represented on heritage websites and digital documents associated with those websites and compares it to how European groups are mentioned. So here's a little example of what I've done. This is from a site that's not covered in my master's work, but actually my PhD work, the colony of Avalon on the south coast of Newfoundland, or the Avalon Peninsula on the southern shore. But you can see here that the colony of Avalon is a 17th century archaeology site, and it's associated with the English, and it has many artifacts. And this is from Parks Canada's website. But what about the Beothic? So there's lots of archaeological evidence that shows many Beothic artifacts and features associated with the site. And in fact, it's actually the most easternly known Beothic site in Newfoundland, but yet it's not mentioned at all in its description. And here's another example. This one here is about Hebron, which is in northern Labrador, and it is stated to be or had associated with it a church, a mission house, a store, a forge, a carpenter shop, and other structures that are no longer there. So what about the Inuit? There's archaeological evidence, ethnographic evidence, and oral history that shows many Inuit artifacts and occupation, but yet, again, it's not mentioned in the Parks Canada description. And then we see here another description of the site, but we note that it mentions Inuit, it mentions how culturally important it is, um, and it was once home to many, various indications of both European and Indigenous settlement. So as it says here in the bubble, in addition to the Moravian activities, we also see cultural significance to the Nunatsiavut Inuit. So which one do you think it would be written by or in collaboration with the Nunatsiavut Inuit? So hopefully you said the bottom one, because the top one was made by Parks Canada and the bottom one was made by Tourism Nunatsiavut. So this is the kind of thing that I'm looking for, the differences in how they're portrayed and shown online. So my second method was a secondary literature review. So this looked at archival evidence and research done by primarily university professors and researchers at MUN's Department of Archaeology and Department of Anthropology. And also looked at some gray literature that was done outside of academia, but to get an idea of what's in the scholarship, what's in the public sphere, and to make that comparison of what's being presented to the public online. So here are some examples of the articles that have come out about Lansing Meadows in particular. Some results and discussion. So I know this is quite a lot to look at once, but once I explain it, hopefully it'll be a bit clearer. So this is the number of mentions of European and Indigenous cultural groups at Red Bay and Lansing Meadows. So you'll see here under the Red Bay tab, we have mentions of Europeans, mention of Indigenous groups, and the same done for Lansing Meadows. So at the bottom, when you see total mentions, you can see that Red Bay actually mentions European groups 7 times more than they mention Indigenous groups. And then for Lansing Meadows, you can see that it's almost 3 times more than how they mention Indigenous groups. And you can see that the websites and documents I looked at included those from Tourism Newfoundland and Labrador, the UNESCO World Heritage Center, as well as Parks Canada. And I also want to note that these keywords that were looked for the Europeans included just general mention of European groups, but also Basque, French, English, Norse, Viking, and Dutch in particular. And then for Indigenous groups, we looked for Indigenous, Aboriginal, Indian, Native, Inuit, Innu, Mi'kmaq, or First Nations, or First Nations. So for the discussion, is this responsible exhibition? And just a reminder that responsible exhibition is the careful presentation of Indigenous knowledge and cultural artifacts based on Indigenous collaboration. And it's based on 3 principles, which we'll talk about in just a second. But overall, from what I've gathered in my research, Red Bay and Lansing Meadows do not meet these intentions by primarily directly omitting Indigenous material culture, poorly representing Indigenous cultures, and using past Indigenous occupation solely as justification for UNESCO recognition, which is a form of tokenism. So we'll talk about this a bit more. So the first principle, promoting reconciliation. So does it promote reconciliation? It doesn't, because it uses outdated terms that undermines reconciliation by refusing Indigenous people's ability to self-determine their identity. So instead of using their name, it's very much terms such as ancient Indian band, things like that. It doesn't use the proper names that we have determined moving forward in academia and together in partnership with Indigenous groups. And they also only used Indigenous occupation to justify their UNESCO World Heritage standing. So both these applications for Red Bay and Lansing Meadows mention an abundance of Indigenous occupation throughout time and use it uh, as a piece of why this place should be recognized as a status site, but yet there's no mention, or very little mention, I should say, of Indigenous cultures on their digital heritage. I believe Lansing Meadows is the only place that mentions it, and when it does, like I said earlier, it's very much dated, uh, inaccurate language that we no longer use, or that was never okay. And it also neglects current Indigenous peoples. There's no mention of where these sites currently or fall into Indigenous occupation now. Um, and it also mentions very little of the past cultures. So Lansing Meadows markets Indigenous culture only when it's significant to the Vikings. So, for example, there, I believe Indigenous peoples come up in when they talk about the Vikings coming to Newfoundland and discovering Newfoundland completes the circle of the globe for humanity. Like it's the first time that humanity has fully circled the globe. And that's really the only time Indigenous peoples are mentioned in the story other than their little Aboriginal sites tab that, again, dated terminology as we've seen in the last couple of slides. Sim Principle 2, so presenting Indigenous history. So local Indigenous groups are not featured in sites digital heritage, as we've seen, only as ancient groups, so very little mention of Indigenous heritage there. Indigenous groups do not appear to be consulted, and this is shown in the dated and accurate information. Again, there's no mention of contemporary Indigenous groups and those who have land claims in those areas or are working on land claims in those areas. And it's often written from the narrative of a settler or things that settlers would be interested in, such as the brave adventures of the Vikings and so on and so forth. The lack of Indigenous histories might be linked to the growing European tourism in the area. So there's a lot of people coming from Europe to visit these sites. So naturally, the Vikings and settler history is perceived as more marketable to these groups. So overall, does not do a very good job presenting Indigenous history when there's a lot of Indigenous history there. And the final principle, showing visitors impacts of settler colonialism. So we have websites that feature outdated terms, supporting colonial notions of successful assimilation. So again, the outdated terms, specifically prehistoric peoples, really sets Indigenous peoples in the past and neglects to recognize how settler colonial administration has impacted Indigenous groups and their perception in Newfoundland and Labrador. And then it also delegitimizes Indigenous historical knowledge by not recognizing current Indigenous groups. So it really takes away and uh, cuts under Indigenous temporal priority in the province. And the limit of representation shows Indigenous peoples are only allowed a very specific visibility. So as I said earlier, we only really, or the sites only really talk about Indigenous groups when it's either helpful to them getting status with UNESCO or when it is important to the story of the Vikings and their discovery. So moving forward, fix my notes. So first and foremost, this research was conducted by me. I'm a settler anthropologist in training, whose discipline is heavily rooted in Western Eurocentric thinking. And as such, this report cannot speak for Indigenous communities who have occupied the areas of Red Bay and Lansing Meadows since time immemorial. And my strongest recommendation is that stakeholders, including non-Indigenous Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, historians and anthropologists, and rights holders, the provincial government, federal government, work with Indigenous communities in developing Indigenous digital heritage for these sites and others in Newfoundland and Labrador. So more specific recommendations, increase Indigenous representation within the digital heritage of Red Bay and Lansing Meadows. To simply combat the underrepresentation that we see there, there's from the table I showed earlier, there's very little Indigenous representation, especially compared to the European settler representation at these sites. My second recommendation is to implement the most current and respected terminology based on consultation with the Indigenous communities that fall within the site. and a heritage statement and territory acknowledgement. Now, I think that the territory acknowledgement is pretty straightforward. We did one in the beginning of this presentation, but a heritage statement is something that I've only seen for the first time when I went to Nova Scotia to visit the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. And they had a heritage statement, or I think it was called a museum statement, that recognized the limitation of current exhibits and the procedures that they use to represent minority groups, and that they were working on it and collaborating with uh, people of color, indigenous groups, non-neurotypical or I should say neurodiverse people, um, to give a better representation of heritage that's important to those communities, which I thought was really good and something that I would like to see at least in these two sites for now and moving forward. And then heritage professionals must collaborate with Indigenous communities on best practices for representing Indigenous cultures in line with a responsible exhibition. So if you get anything from my presentation today, is that collaboration and working uh, with the community and for the community is one of the strongest recommendations I can make on how to move forward in studying with Indigenous populations. So my acknowledgement. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I'd also like to thank my project funding from Memorial University as well as Eastern Health for their scholarship program, and my project supervisors, Dr. Carolina Titleman and Dr. Lincoln Addison, both of the anthropology department at MUN. And of course, if you have any questions, if you'd like to talk about my research project, what it's like doing archaeology and anthropology at MUN at the undergrad and graduate levels, I can certainly speak to that. But yeah, if you have any questions, please send me an email at jthogan@mun.ca. Thank you for joining me. Have a great night.